Welcome to EKO201E Economics. I'm Chris Hannum. This is lecture 12 on monopoly. So again, this is part of this 5-lecture unit on market structure and the behavior of the firm, decisions by the firm. In the first of those, we talked about productivity and costs and how costs are determined for firms. In the second, we talked about how important those costs were in the various decisions that firms need to make in competitive markets. But we specifically focused on that extreme case of a market that's perfectly competitive. Now that perfect competition that we described for the market, that's an example of what we call market structure. A perfectly competitive market structure was one with many firms, actually, and arbitrarily many firms, infinitely many firms. The other very extreme case that we'll talk about today is a market structure referred to as monopoly. Monopoly means one. We have one and only one firm. And that one and only one firm is the only company that sells that product. Because it's one and not potentially two or potentially three, this is an extreme and limiting case. On the latter two lectures, we'll talk about oligopoly and monopolistic competition, which are a bit less extreme. But for now, we'll focus on monopoly. We also assume if this firm is going to be a real monopoly, so this market is really monopolized, there must not just be one company producing that good, but that good must not have very many close substitutes. That is to say, Apple may have a monopoly on the iPhone X, but the iPhone X has other close substitutes. There's other companies that make products that are similar to an iPhone X. So while they may be a monopoly, we would say that they compete with those other companies that make fairly similar products. That will be the market structure we call monopolistic competition. For a pure monopoly, a true monopoly, it should be a single company where it's the only seller of a good, and that good in question is quite different from any other product that people might want to buy. For example, electricity. You might have a market in which there's a single company that produces and sells electricity. Buyers have no other option rather than to buy electricity from that particular seller. And electricity is really not very similar to any other product that they might buy, so it has no close substitutes. Now, the key difference, both in our market structure of monopoly that we'll talk about now, and also the latter two, oligopoly and monopolistic competition, are that firms in those market structures have market power. So that key feature of a perfectly competitive market, that firms are price takers. None of them has any market power. Because they don't have market power and are price takers, they simply observe a price and react to it, as opposed to trying to decide how they could influence the price. For any firm with market power, like a monopoly, one of the most important decisions that they need to make is what price to charge. A perfectly competitive firm does not need to make that decision. They see a market price, they charge it. There's no thought given, because there's absolutely nothing they can do to cause the market price to be higher. And if they charge a price that's higher than the market price, no one will buy, because there are infinitely many competitors, all of which sell exactly the same good. Obviously, that's not true for a monopoly, with one and only one company that can choose a price. It's also not going to be true for competitive monopolies or for oligopolies. They can also influence the price, even if they don't have as much power over it as a monopoly does. Our first question, before we try to explain how a monopoly will make decisions and what the implications of those decisions will be, are why we might have a monopoly in the first place. Why is it that we have only one company in this industry? The most important reason is barriers to entry. We can't have a monopoly if we don't have barriers to entry. That means we assumed in perfectly competitive markets that there are no barriers or very low barriers to entry, so that whenever there are profits, more companies will enter. Now, for us to maintain a monopoly where that monopoly is profitable, it must be the case that monopoly's profits can't lure any other firm in. They may not be able to lure any other firm in because there's some barrier that keeps those firms out. They would love to enter that market, compete with a monopoly, and take away some of their profits, but they can't. There could be a legal barrier to their ability to entry, or there could be some kind of a technical barrier to their ability to enter. Or they could lack access to some kind of a resource that prevented them from entering that market. Maybe in order to make diamonds for jewelry, we need access to diamonds in mines in the ground, and maybe only one company has access to those. They would be able to employ a barrier to keep other firms out of the market for finished diamonds. Or maybe only one firm has the technology that's required to make a product. Or maybe only one firm has a patent that allows them to make that product. All of those would be barriers to entry that allow a monopoly to continue to be a monopoly over time, even when it is making profits. We could also have a situation in which there was only one company, but that one company wasn't profitable. It could actually be either a perfectly competitive market or arbitrarily close to a perfectly competitive market, just with the constraint that the market demand was so weak that there was no profit to justify the entry of a second company, third company, fourth company into that market. So in the absence of barriers to entry, we can't have a monopoly maintained over time. So for all intents and purposes, we can't have a monopoly. As our only other case for what is likely to cause a monopoly, which might mean a monopoly with quite different characteristics than a monopoly which is actually caused by a legal barrier to entry or caused by being the only firm with access to certain resources, is natural monopoly. Natural monopoly comes about whenever we have a firm with increasing returns to scale. So their marginal cost decreases and their average total cost decreases as they produce more output up to a quantity which is substantially larger than the quantity that the market can support, the quantity that people are willing to buy. They might still have some efficient scale, some point at which they cease having these increasing returns to scale and might begin to have decreasing returns to scale. They may have some minimum to their long-run average total cost curve, but if they do, that quantity is just so large that it's not particularly relevant for the market that they have such a minimum long-run average total cost. For all intents and purposes, their long-run average total cost simply slopes down. And if that's the case, for a natural monopoly, a firm or a market with that characteristic, the largest firm, if we ever have more than one firm, the largest firm will always have the lowest costs. The largest firm will always have the lowest long-run average total cost. So the largest firm could always simply charge a price which was lower than the price that anyone else could charge. And they could outcompete any smaller firm. So in a case when we have these economies of scale out to a very large quantity, the natural logic of competition in that market would be that the largest firm outcompetes smaller firms and grows and pushes those smaller firms out of the market until inevitably it's the only company left. And once it's the only company left, there's no explicit barrier to entry, but any other firm that would like to enter knows they won't be able to produce at the same cost that this very large existing firm can. So once that firm is the only firm left, it can behave like a monopoly, exactly as it could if there were a legal barrier to entry or a barrier to entry caused by access to a resource like diamonds in the ground. I will come back to this distinction of natural monopoly versus other types of a monopoly when we talk about, towards the end of this lecture, the ways in which public policy might address the problems that arise because of monopoly, because public policy would need to be different in cases of natural monopoly. But for now, let's just bear in mind that these two kinds of monopolies, even though the reason from which they arise is different, should actually behave in very much the same way. Now, the demand curve that a perfectly competitive business sees, since a perfectly competitive business is just one of many, many, many competitors, all they see is a price. And they can potentially sell a small or large quantity at that price. They could sell as much as they want at that price, because no matter how much, by assumption, they tried to sell, they would still continue to be extremely small relative to the entire market. That's by assumption when we talk about a perfectly competitive market, because that's an extreme case. So the demand curve that an individual perfectly competitive firm sees is horizontal. They can pick any point on that demand curve, for all intents and purposes, that they would like to produce and sell at, but it's horizontal. So on that demand curve, they might choose the point where their marginal cost or supply curve intersected it, and that point would be, as we mentioned, where marginal revenue or price is equal to marginal cost, that quantity. Now, for a monopoly, there is no competition. So the monopoly is not small relative to the entire market. They are the entirety of market supply. And if they decide to double their output, that means doubling market output or doubling market quantity supplied. And because that monopoly makes up the entire market, the demand curve that they see for the product isn't a tiny, infinitesimally small fraction of market demand. It's all of market demand. So the demand curve that a monopoly sees is the normal downward sloping market demand curve. And to the extent that we might say they have a supply curve, a marginal cost curve, there would be a point there that they could see where their upward sloping marginal cost curve intersected that downward sloping market demand curve. We mentioned that for a perfectly competitive firm, marginal revenue and price wound up being the same thing, because there was absolutely nothing that that firm, being perfectly competitive, could do to influence the price. The price was constant, didn't vary with their output. For a monopoly, that's not true. Whereas a perfectly competitive firm can pick any point on a horizontal demand curve, a monopolist picks any point they want on a downward sloping demand curve. So they can choose any bundle of price and quantity on that demand curve that they want, whichever one maximizes their profits. But in contrast to a firm that's perfectly competitive, when a monopoly does this, they'll see that if they want to sell more output, they have to lower the price. The only way they can convince people to buy more is if they reduce the price. For a firm that's perfectly competitive, they can sell more if they want to sell more without lowering the price, because there's so many other competitors out there whose customers they can take away. Now, there are no customers for any other competitors that a monopoly can take away. They have to convince people who aren't currently buying this good at all to buy it from them. And the only way that they can do that is to make it worth their while by lowering the price. So somebody's willing to buy with a willingness to pay that was below the original price. Now, what that means is that the marginal revenue for a monopolist isn't going to be the same as the price. The marginal revenue for a monopolist is the change in their total revenue when they increase the quantity that they produce. That was the change same as the price if we looked at a perfectly competitive firm, because the price didn't change as they increased the quantity. But for a monopolist, the price will go down as they increase their quantity. So the marginal revenue will be less than the price. And this will be true for all levels of output and increases of output. The marginal revenue, or the relationship between marginal revenue and price, marginal revenue curve, will always be below the demand curve, which represents the market price. Suppose our simple example is a coffee shop, and our coffee shop is producing some quantity from 1 to 6, 0 to 6, or depending on scale, 0 to 6,000, what have you. The different prices that they could charge, the different prices that they would be able to charge and sell that particular quantity, and those combinations of quantity and price they describe the demand curve for this particular firm. That if they were trying to sell a quantity of 1, they could find one person that would be willing to pay 4. But the marginal buyer of the 6th unit would only be willing to pay 1.5, going on down the demand curve as we increase the quantity that they produce. Now, the total revenue for this firm, if the firm is a monopolist, the total revenue is just the price times the quantity, because we're assuming that if this monopolist sells all of their goods for 150, 1.5, they won't be able to sell some for a higher price and then a few for a lower price. If they want to sell 6, they need to sell all units for the same price, and that would be the price that's required to get the 6th person to buy, which is 1.5. So we can calculate for each of those bundles on the demand curve total revenue. That total revenue, if they produce 1 unit and sell it for 4, is 4. The total revenue, if they produce 2 units and sell them for 3.5, is 7. The total revenue, if they produce 3 units and sell them for 3, is 9. And so on. As they produce more, the price falls. The total revenue goes from 9, then to 10, then stays at 10, and then falls back down to 9 again. Also, average revenue for these units that they produce. Average revenue would simply be that total revenue divided by the amount that they produce. So if they have a total revenue of 4 for 1 unit, their average revenue is 4. But if they have a total revenue of 7 producing 2 units, their average revenue is 3.5. The average revenue is always still the same as the price for a monopolist or for a perfectly competitive firm. In that way, they're the same, but unfortunately, average revenue doesn't tell us very much for business decision-making purposes. What does is marginal revenue. Marginal revenue, that's the change in total revenue as they increase the quantity that they produce by 1. So that marginal revenue of producing the first unit, going from total revenue of 0 to total revenue of 4, was 4. And the marginal revenue of the second unit, going from a total revenue of 4 to a total revenue of 7, was only 3. The marginal revenue, going from a quantity of 2 to a quantity of 3, where their total revenue goes from 7 to 9, marginal revenue is 2. So marginal revenue is decreasing as they produce more, just like price is decreasing. But marginal revenue, except for the first unit, marginal revenue is always less than the price, the average revenue that they're receiving. For the second unit, the average revenue is 3.5, but the marginal revenue is only 3. For the third unit, the average revenue is 3, but the marginal revenue is only 2. We go on down until we see that for the fifth unit has exactly the same total revenue as the fourth unit. So the marginal revenue for the fifth unit is 0. And actually for the sixth unit, the price has fallen by so much that total revenue is less than for 5 units, and the marginal revenue for the sixth unit is negative. And again, we mentioned in the case of perfectly competitive firms that all firms that try to maximize their profits should produce a unit so long as the marginal cost to produce it was less than the marginal revenue, the additional revenue that selling it would generate. And for perfectly competitive firms, that meant that price should be greater than marginal cost. But really, price should only be greater than marginal cost because marginal revenue should be greater than marginal cost. And for those firms, marginal revenue and price are the same. For a monopolist, marginal revenue and price are not the same, but they should still choose to produce a unit of output only if marginal revenue is greater than the price. So here, if the price is 2, they wouldn't be willing to produce a unit of output with a marginal revenue of only 1. So they should produce the third unit, but they should not produce the fourth unit. Now, as we plot these, the demand curve for this simple coffee shop example and the marginal revenue curve that goes along with it, for this simple coffee shop example in 2-dimensional space with price or something monetary on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis, what we can see is that that curve, that line that we call the marginal revenue curve, is always underneath the demand curve, where the demand curve is going to define the market price, but the marginal revenue curve is what the monopolist needs to consider when deciding whether or not production is worthwhile. We describe the reason for this relationship between a monopolist's quantity and marginal revenue as taking into account two effects. The first is the output effect on the revenues of the firm. If the firm produces more, the firm has higher output and as a result has higher revenues. Now, for a perfectly competitive firm, that's the only effect to consider. As the perfectly competitive firm produces more output, they have higher revenues. On the other hand, for a monopolist, there's also a price effect. Whereas the output effect causes total revenues to rise as the monopolist produces more output, the price effect, meaning that in order to sell extra output, the price must fall, has a negative impact on the firm's total revenues. If the output effect is larger than the price effect, then increasing revenues is what we'll see as a firm chooses a higher level of output. On the other hand, if the price effect outweighs the output effect, we'll expect to see lower revenues as a firm produces a higher level of output. And in any case, compared to a perfectly competitive firm, in which case there is only an output, and only an output effect, the price effect is always negative. So a perfectly competitive firm will always have a larger increase in revenues as they increase their output than a monopolist would, because a monopolist has a price effect that eats away at some of those increased revenues. And we mention again, firms which are monopolies will choose in exactly the same way that a profit-maximizing perfectly competitive firm would, how to maximize their profits by choosing a quantity of output. But they're going to choose a quantity of output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And then in contrast to a perfectly competitive firm, they're not going to be charging a price equal to marginal revenue and marginal cost. They're going to choose that quantity of output based on where marginal revenue intersects marginal cost. And then they're going to choose a price which is the maximum price the market is willing to pay for that quantity of output. And we can find the maximum price the market is willing to pay for that quantity of output on the demand curve. And it will wind up being, since the marginal revenue curve is always below the demand curve, because marginal revenue is always less than the price, it will be above the marginal revenue curve. It will be greater. The market price will be greater than marginal revenue and greater than marginal cost. Then we can illustrate, if we plot, again, our marginal cost curve for the monopolist, we plot the marginal revenue and demand curves for the monopolist, we plot that average total cost curve for the monopolist, we can find when the monopolist chooses that profit-maximizing quantity of output and chooses the price that's consistent with that profit-maximizing quantity of output, exactly what their profit is. So we find that combination of price and quantity, and that price, in this case, as you can see, that price that they're able to charge when they produce that quantity is greater than average total cost. The gap between that price and average total cost, that's a profit margin, and that profit rectangle represents total profit on that graph. I mentioned in the context of perfectly competitive markets that perfectly competitive firms can also earn profits. Sometimes the price might rise high enough that the price is substantially greater than average total cost. But we said that in the case of a perfectly competitive firm, those profits would be temporary. Because in the long run, those profits would act as an incentive for other businesses not currently in that market to enter, or for businesses that don't currently exist to start up. In the case of a monopoly, there are barriers to entry. There's something keeping those firms that would like to enter and take some of these profits away out. So there's no natural tendency for that price to fall back down or for competition to take some demand away, to shift market supply, or anything like that. If the firm is a monopoly, these profits can be earned in perpetuity. Next to mention, whereas we said in the case of perfectly competitive firms and perfectly competitive markets, we can define a supply curve by their marginal cost, those perfectly competitive firms, they do decide to produce up to any point on that supply curve where it's equal to the price. And for that reason, we call it a supply curve. If the firm is a monopoly, they don't choose to produce at any point on their marginal cost curve equal to the price. They choose to produce at a point on their marginal cost curve equal to a marginal revenue. So it's not exactly the same as a supply curve at all. And rather than draw any more detailed distinctions, we'd simply say that we wouldn't consider monopolists, strictly speaking, to have a supply curve. Monopolists will make a decision about the price and about the quantity supplied simultaneously, rather than choosing a quantity to supply based on a price that they observe, as perfectly competitive firms do. That doesn't mean that they don't have marginal cost curves that look exactly like the marginal cost curves for perfectly competitive firms, which we call perfectly competitive firms' supply curve. Now, for our first example, we want to use a realistic case where a monopoly does exist, and this would be a monopoly for a prescription drug. So the way this market works in the real world, as we mentioned several lectures ago, is that patents are granted for new prescription drugs by governments to the firms that invent them. They can prove that their research and development is responsible for the design of this brand new pharmaceutical product, and in order to reward them for their innovation, to incentivize further research and development expenditures, to incentivize the creation of new knowledge, governments actually give them the exclusive right to produce that product. So they are a monopoly because the government has granted them a monopoly in that particular product market. The government granted them a monopoly which keeps all other firms out and prevents them from being able to produce that good, no matter how profitable it is to produce that pharmaceutical. Now, the contrast then is with generic drug makers. Now, a generic drug is a non-patented drug. So, for a first number of years, usually 10 years, after a new prescription drug is invented, patents prevent other companies from participating in that market. They prevent entry. But after 10 years, those patents generally expire, which allows other businesses to now enter the market, compete with this pharmaceutical firm, and produce another version of this product. So we'll look at what happens when the good is patented, and then what happens when it becomes generic. And here, for simplicity's sake, we'll just imagine that the marginal cost to produce this drug is fixed. That is to say, we may have a fixed cost for research and development, which is very large, but the marginal cost to produce one more pill is very small, and it's just equal to PC. Now, then we have a downward sloping demand curve in this market for this prescription drug, and because it's a downward sloping demand curve, the monopolist who sees the entire downward sloping market demand curve has a downward sloping marginal revenue curve underneath that demand curve. Now, this monopolist will choose a quantity to produce where that marginal revenue curve intersects their horizontal marginal cost curve. And that's what you see at QM. We call it QM because it's the quantity, Q, the monopolist would produce, monopolist being M. And then that QM leads the monopolist to charge the highest price the market will bear in order to sell QM units, which is a higher price than their cost, PM, the monopolist price. So we call that marginal cost PC because if this market was competitive, which it is not, at least not until the patent expires, that price is what the market would naturally charge. It would be price equal to marginal cost for all of these businesses to produce, where all businesses have a marginal cost, which is the same, which is fixed, which is constant. So now, this monopolist, if we have a price equal to PM being charged and QM being produced, will earn a profit equal to PM minus PC on each and every unit that they sell. And they'll sell QM units, so if they sell QM units, their total profit will be QM times PM minus PC. That rectangle or square there on your graph. Last to note, in this particular scenario, that if the market is competitive, all of the firms will charge PC, and they'll all choose a point where that PC equals marginal cost, and that point will give us a competitive market quantity of QC. That QC is the point that's consistent with a market price of PC equal to the marginal cost, also equal to PC. So if we have a competitive market, so our patent expires, now we have generic drug producers that are producing this particular pharmaceutical product, then the market will produce QC, it will produce a larger quantity than the monopolist would have chosen to produce. And the competitive market will charge a price of only PC, which is less than PM. PC, I mean the competitive market price. One of the things that we said about the supply and demand diagram in welfare economics for a perfectly competitive market scenario that was desirable was that each and every unit of a good that was produced had a marginal benefit to somebody or willingness to pay by somebody as defined by the demand curve, which was higher than the marginal cost to some business to produce it for each and every unit that actually was produced. And also that each and every unit for which we would have a higher marginal benefit to somebody than a marginal cost to somebody else would be produced. That would give us that equilibrium quantity that we happen to see with perfectly competitive markets. Now, if we have a monopolist instead of a perfectly competitive market, that monopolist chooses to produce less. Now, individuals have to pay a higher price. They have to pay that monopolist price. But monopolists also choose to produce less. And they choose to produce less because they want to be able to charge a higher price. And if they do charge a higher price, they can't find people who are willing to buy as many as the original equilibrium competitive market quantity. As a result, there are some units there, as you can see in the previous graph, there's some units of output where somebody, some demander would have been willing to pay a price that was higher than that marginal cost, higher than that competitive market price, but higher than that marginal cost for the monopolist. In theory, welfare for all of society would be increased if that unit was produced and sold, whatever the price would be. If that unit was produced and sold, somebody's benefit would be greater than somebody else's cost. And the fact that the monopoly does not produce those units leads the monopoly to result in less welfare, less benefit for all of society than a perfectly competitive market would. They're not just taking consumer surplus away from consumers by charging higher prices. They're also creating deadweight loss, just like a tax did, because they're causing the market quantity to be lower than the market quantity should be at equilibrium. It's no longer the efficient quantity of output. Now, as we plot this in our supply and demand type diagram, although again, this is not strictly speaking a supply curve for a monopolist, again with price on the vertical axis and quantity on the horizontal axis. We can see the quantity that the monopolist chooses to produce, which is defined by marginal cost and marginal revenue, but we can also see the quantity that a perfectly competitive market would produce, which is defined by marginal cost and demand. Because for a perfectly competitive industry, marginal cost and supply would be broadly synonymous. In this case, the perfectly competitive industry would be producing QC, the monopolist would be producing only QM. And what we see is this triangle at the edge of that wedge between the monopoly price and the marginal cost to produce those goods. Here, a green triangle, which represents deadweight loss. It's sum of total surplus that we would have if this market was perfectly competitive, that we don't have because we have a monopoly. Because we have a monopoly, we produce less output, and we have less total surplus as a result. Also note, on this particular diagram, you could draw in producer surplus, as well as you could draw in total surplus. You could draw in consumer surplus, just as you could draw in producer surplus. Consumer surplus, now with a monopoly, is this triangle below the demand curve and above the monopoly price that the monopolist is charging. And that's much smaller than the consumer surplus triangle below the demand curve and above the original competitive market price going out to the competitive market quantity. Clearly, with a monopoly, we don't just have reduced overall welfare, we have reduced consumer surplus. However, when we consider producer surplus, producers will only be producing QM, but it will now be the area above the supply curve out to QM beneath that monopoly price. And this won't be a triangle, in contrast to what it would have been with a competitive market, because the tip of that triangle is clipped off. What we have here is a producer surplus triangle below the marginal cost at that quantity, a monopoly quantity for the firm, plus a big rectangle of additional surplus that's transferred from the consumer to the producer. Now that total area for producer surplus with a monopoly will actually be larger than it originally was. By definition, if it wasn't larger than it originally was, that would not be the ideal, optimal quantity for the monopolist to produce. They would choose to produce where producer surplus, therefore profit, was maximized. So what a monopolist does is captures some of that consumer surplus, takes it away as additional producer surplus, and as a consequence of doing that, reduces the quantity of output and reduces total surplus. Is to say, consumers lose more than producers gain. Even though that monopoly is better for the firm, because profits are higher, producer surplus is higher, it's worse for the market and society overall. So we want to consider another type of scenario where we might have a monopoly that didn't result in the same negative outcomes as far as welfare economics is concerned. And that is the somewhat counterintuitive name, price discrimination. What we mean by discrimination in general is treating any two people differently, depending on some characteristic of that person. We could be treating people differently based on their age. We could be treating people differently based on their gender. Anytime we treat people differently, it's discrimination. Price discrimination is treating people differently by charging them different prices. So, if a firm, such as a monopolist, engages in price discrimination, they could choose to charge a different price, for example, to children or adults. Or they could choose to charge a different price to men or women. Or they could choose a different price to charge in Istanbul versus other regions of the country. Any of these would be considered price discrimination. The most extreme case of price discrimination we could even hypothetically imagine would be if that monopolist could choose a different price to charge each and every single person. So if we suppose hypothetically that that monopolist actually does know everything about you, how exactly they would learn everything about you, I don't know. Maybe the monopolist in question is Facebook, and that's how they've learned all about you. But if we suppose they know your willingness to pay for this product, then a monopolist who can choose what price they will charge you, and only you, would choose to charge you the maximum amount that you were willing to pay, your willingness to pay. Now, if they do that, then they don't have to charge just one price. And if they don't have to charge just one price, then they can lower the price on the next unit they sell by choosing the maximum willingness to pay for the next person that they might try to sell it to, without needing to lower the price that they charge anyone else. Now, their goal, if they're able to perfectly price discriminate, would be to capture all consumer surplus, to charge each and every person their maximum willingness to pay so that they still buy, but they're not really particularly happy with any purchase that they made. They get zero or negligible consumer surplus. All of it goes to the monopolist as additional producer surplus. Now, the key here to bear in mind is if they can charge a different price to each person, then they have no incentive to produce less than a competitive industry would produce. Because as long as somebody is willing to pay a price that's higher than their marginal cost to produce it, and they can force that person, only that person, to pay that price, then they'll be willing to produce all the way out to QC. Every single unit that a perfectly competitive industry would have been willing to produce, a perfectly price discriminating monopoly will also be willing to produce. Now, we take this as sort of an odd case because we say it solves the problem, where the problem is that our total surplus in the presence of a monopoly is low compared to what total surplus would be with a competitive industry. So a monopoly is inefficient compared to what a competitive industry would be. But now if the market is dominated not just by a monopolist, but by a perfectly price discriminating monopolist, in this case, the monopolist makes everyone miserable but the monopolist, but by doing that, cause no loss in welfare, no deadweight loss, and have an outcome that's just as efficient as a perfectly competitive industry would be. In that extreme case of perfect price discrimination, we have no deadweight loss and monopoly itself doesn't generate any problems that need to be solved. On the other hand, our real-world examples of price discrimination aren't extreme and they aren't perfect because real monopolies don't exactly know what your willingness to pay is. So they're not able to charge each and every person their maximum willingness to pay. They may not know who you are that are buying their products to begin with, but they might know that there are different groups of people that have different willingness to pay, or that have different elasticities of demand. So most real-world price discrimination takes place by charging different groups higher or lower prices. Also, one thing that might be a bit counterintuitive when we talk about price discrimination, particularly this kind of price discrimination, this group price discrimination, is that price discrimination doesn't take place, generally speaking, by choosing some group of people and forcing them to pay a high price. Generally speaking, this kind of price discrimination, as opposed to another scenario where the monopolist didn't or couldn't engage in price discrimination, this comes about when the monopolist finds some group of people that aren't able to pay the price that they would normally be charging, that monopolist price, but would be willing to pay some lower price. And they find a way to charge those people and only those people a low price. For example, some restaurants or restaurant chains offer discounted meals to senior citizens at certain times of the day. They're not punishing them for being old. They're giving them a benefit, in essence, for being old by discriminating in favor of them, charging a higher price to normal people, everyone else. We have a couple of key examples of real price discrimination that actually occurs in the real world with products that you may be familiar with. First example being movie tickets. If you go to watch a movie in a theater, you'll notice that different groups of people are charged different prices for the same film. Chiefly, students pay a lower price to see the same movie than other people do. Also, senior citizens may pay a lower price. Retired people, children may pay a lower price than ordinary people do, ordinary people being adults like myself. They may also charge different prices for different times of the day or different days of the week, believing that the willingness to pay for students is lower than for other people, or believing that willingness to pay for people in general is lower on Wednesday than it is on Friday and Saturday. So they believe that they can increase the amount that they sell overall by allowing students to pay a lower price, because if they force students to pay the same high price as they charged everyone else, students would be unlikely to pay at all. They can increase the quantity that they produce, thereby decreasing the deadweight loss associated with their monopoly through these student discounts. It might feel like discrimination ought necessarily to be a bad thing, but here we say it isn't necessarily bad at all, in contrast to a situation where we still have a monopoly, choosing whatever price they want to charge, but they're not able to discriminate based on groups and allow certain groups of people who aren't willing to pay high prices to pay low prices. Second example, which is a market which is almost defined by this price discrimination, because price discrimination is so common and so absolute, is airplane tickets. Plane tickets don't just have different prices for different people, or different prices for different routes, or different prices for different times of the day that you might fly. Airline tickets charge different prices even depending on when you buy. If you buy more than 3 months away, your willingness to pay might be estimated to be higher than somebody who buys a ticket only 1 month away, as your willingness to pay for somebody who buys a ticket 1 day in advance might also be higher than somebody who made a purchase 1 month in advance. And again, although it might feel like price discrimination should necessarily be a bad thing, the alternative we might imagine if these airline companies are monopolists and can charge whatever price they want for their flights, is that we would see a universally high price. And many people would not be willing to pay that high price and wouldn't fly at all. But that monopolist wouldn't be willing to lower the price that they charge so that they wouldn't have to charge a low price also to people with very high willingness to pay, which are chiefly, in that particular industry, business travelers rather than recreational or leisure travelers. So now if we've established that monopolies are bad, so monopolies reduce total welfare in our economy, they make our economy less efficient, unless we have an extreme case where that monopoly is a perfect price discriminator and can charge each and every person their maximum willingness to pay. And even if that's the case, they capture so much of the total surplus that consumers are far worse off than they would have been in a competitive market. What can we do about those monopolies? What kind of public policy could solve this problem? Well, the first obvious solution that might come to mind is that if that market was competitive, instead of being a monopoly with only one firm, the problem would go away on its own. If we have barriers to entry, we could remove them. Remove those barriers to entry, allow other firms in, and the monopoly's market power is gone. They're no longer able to charge a very high price. They're no longer interested in restricting the quantity that they produce. We can make that market competitive. Now, if it's possible for us to simply remove those barriers, or to take an existing enormous firm and break it up, which has been done in the United States a few times in the past. This was done to a telecommunications monopoly, AT&T, which was broken into many smaller telecommunications companies. It was done to an oil monopoly called Standard Oil, which was broken up into many smaller oil companies. Now, if that's possible, that might be the ideal solution to a problem of monopoly. Simply force that market to have competition, if it does not otherwise naturally have competition. Now, this is facilitated in the United States and other countries through laws, through legislation that may make being a monopoly illegal and may authorize certain sanctions by the government if a firm is determined to be a monopoly. So we might see court cases raised using these pieces of legislation to determine whether or not a firm is a monopoly, in which case the courts might decide on a certain solution, a certain way to make that market more competitive. A few decades ago, Microsoft was involved in just such a court case to rule whether Microsoft was a monopoly in operating systems, just Windows. And if Microsoft was a monopoly, whether Microsoft was abusing its ability to set prices in that market, and whether something should be done under these pieces of legislation to force competition. Unfortunately, in many cases in which we have a monopoly and we clearly have deadweight loss, we clearly have consumer losses as a result of this monopoly, that monopoly comes about because of natural monopoly. That is to say, there's no natural tendency in this market to maintain competition over time. Even if we create more companies by breaking up that monopoly, or even if we remove whatever barriers to entry might exist, the natural logic of that market, due to increasing returns to scale, will lead over time the number of firms to shrink again, as the largest of those firms outcompetes all of the smaller firms. So the natural logic of a natural monopoly will be to inevitably trend toward one firm and monopoly, leading to deadweight loss. So we can't solve that problem by causing competition. We could only solve that kind of a problem, a natural monopoly problem, through regulation. Also, to point out, a firm might act like a natural monopoly, such that the natural tendency of that market was to have only one firm, not just because that one biggest firm could outcompete other firms in terms of cost, which is what we illustrate with this economies of scale, downward sloping long-run average total cost. What's important with many particularly high-tech industries is that it may be the case that we have what's called a network externality, such that the larger the network is for the dominant player in this market, the more desirable the product is. And if the product is more desirable for the largest player in that industry, invariably, for example, say the product is a messaging app. And if our product is a messaging app, and our messaging app is more useful the more other people are using it, necessarily the product is better for the largest competitor in that market. And the largest competitor in that market will have a natural tendency to outcompete all other firms. And the natural tendency will be to have one firm, just as with a natural monopoly, where costs decrease the larger that firm becomes. In this case, with network externalities, the quality of the product increases as the firm becomes larger, and the largest firm inevitably has the best product. Now, if it's the case we have either network externalities or a natural monopoly, the only way that we can solve this problem, since we can't create competition, it will inevitably disappear if we do, is through regulation of the price and or quantity that monopolist would be allowed to charge. We could require that monopolist to charge a price equal to marginal cost. So if we did that, then that monopolist would behave exactly as a perfectly competitive industry would do, because they couldn't control the price. They could only control their quantity. And if they could only control their quantity, they would choose to produce up to that quantity where their marginal cost was equal to the price, just like a perfectly competitive industry. Now, if we didn't have natural monopoly such that long-run average total cost decreased and decreased and decreased the larger our business became, that sort of a regulatory solution would work perfectly, to the extent that it would eliminate all those deadweight losses that come about from a monopoly. Just in the same way as if we had actually forced competition to occur in that market. The problem is that if we do have a natural monopoly, and that's the reason why we need a regulatory solution, if the natural monopoly were to charge a price equal to marginal cost, that marginal cost for a natural monopoly is always less than average total cost. We said wherever average total cost is sloping down, marginal cost is underneath or less than average total cost. So if we forced them to charge only a price equal to marginal cost, they would lose money. They couldn't potentially break even, much less make a profit. So what we would determine then is what price, allow them to charge a price equal to long-run average total cost, and try to make that long-run average total cost intersect the demand curve where they do. Charge a price equal to where long-run intersect, to charge a price equal to where the long-run average total cost intersects the demand curve, and insist that the business produce that quantity. So one other potential solution that we could imagine, if we have a natural monopoly and therefore we can't feasibly force businesses to charge a price equal to marginal cost without losing money, is that the government could subsidize them in order to keep them operating while forcing them to charge a very low price. Another alternative solution, neither through regulation or through forcing competition to take place in the market, is if we observe that this market is a natural monopoly, we might prefer to nationalize that industry. In the United States, because the government in the United States tends to prefer private ownership of industry, this solution is relatively rare, but in many European economies, it's common. We have natural monopolies which are nationalized and become state-owned. So that natural monopoly may be allowed to earn positive profits, but then those profits are returned to the government budget. Or that natural monopoly may necessarily, if the price is restricted and held closer to marginal cost, may lose money. They have negative profits and be subsidized from the national budget because it's a state-owned enterprise. One example in the United States would be the Postal Service. But there are many other examples around the world as well. And the last solution, which is the solution in the United States that was proposed in the case of Microsoft, amounts to basically doing nothing. To argue that while there are costs, there are welfare costs, there are deadweight losses associated with monopoly, there are also costs and potential deadweight losses that could arise because of potential mechanisms to solve these problems. And we might actually be better off doing nothing and simply allowing the monopoly to operate, might be better off than we would be if we broke that monopoly up and forced competition. As in, for example, a market with network effects, where the quality of the product might be greater if we have only one firm. We might also, if we were to regulate the price that a firm such as Microsoft were to charge, we might find that we had disincentivized research and development and therefore improvement in technology and product quality over time. If we're worried about those things, we might be content to simply allow that monopoly to operate, at least until the way in which that monopoly operates becomes so egregious and damaging to the economy that regulators could be forced to act. So in summary, when we're looking at monopoly, we're looking at an extreme case, and because it's an extreme case which is bad, first, it's rarely going to occur to begin with, and second, when it does occur, governments are likely to intervene in a variety of ways, either to prevent those monopolies from behaving in this way, to force those monopolies to become competitive industries, or to nationalize those monopolies such that the government has control over quantity and pricing decisions. Now, because of that, we very rarely see in the real world true unregulated monopolies to give us natural examples of how monopolies behave. What we tend to see is regulated monopolies, such as electrical and water utilities, or former monopolies, such as the American oil industry, or nationalized monopolies, such as Russia's Gazprom gas company. But we don't tend to see what these companies would do without regulation, nationalization, or competition.